As the sequence of performance, first is primary obligation, the principal object of the contract. Means, thou prefers for the principal object of their contract, thou cannot be resolved. So, ang pag-aalilangan ay tumutukoy sa pangunahing layunin ng kontrata, ang pagdududa ay hindi malulutas. So, next is secondary obligations, one which of contracted and it's to be performed in case the primary obligation cannot be performed. So, sabi dito, one which is contracted and is to be performed in case the primary obligations cannot be performed. So, isa na kinontrata at dapat gampanan in case the primary obligation ay hindi maisasagawa. Next is as to subject, principal obligation, one which arises from the principal object of the engagements of the contracting parties. So, it differs from an accessory obligation. For example, in the sale of a horse, the principal obligation of the seller is to deliver the horse. The obligation to take case from him, field delivered is an accessory engagement. By principal obligation is also understood those engagements of one who become bound for himself and for the benefit of another. So next is accessory obligation, one which depend upon or peripheral or collateral to the principal. So, dito naman is ito yung mga paghahabol para sa mga pinsala na nagre-resulta mula sa pagkakasala sa isang pagtatapos ng kontrata, paglabag sa mga obligasyon sa kontraktual na accessory. Nagpapahirap na pagkilos ay ibinukod maliban kung ang aming pananagutan ay batay sa labis na kapabayaan. Next is kinds of obligations under the Civil Code. First is pure and conditional obligations. Second, obligation with a period. Third, alternative obligation. Fourth, joint and solidarity obligation. Fifth, divisible and indivisible obligations. And sixth, obligations with a penal clause. So, pure obligation. Every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or certain event or past event unknown to the parties is demandable at once is called a pure obligation. So, sabi dito, ang pure obligation is to yung walang specific time and date. Kumbaga, ito yung obligation na yan ay walang conditions para magawa yung parang malayang obligation. So, ang lahat ng pure obligations ay demandable at once. Ibig sabihin dito, kung walang condition at period, ito ay pure obligation na demandable at once. So, next ay conditional obligation. So, conditional obligation is the one fulfillment of which is dependent upon the happening of an event. So, ang conditional obligation naman is ito yung kabaligtaran ng pure obligation. Kung sa conditional may specific, ito yung condition para mangyari o hindi mangyari ang isang bagay. Pwedeng maging positive or negative yung result. Ang conditional obligation ay nakadepend sa condition na nakakonsidered sa future and uncertain event or pwede din siyang past event unknown to the parties. So, huwag natin ilalagay sa confuse ang condition from obligation. So, kapag inanalyze natin yon, ang obligation to do that to do. Next is alternative obligation. An alternative obligation is one where out of two or more prestation which may be given or performed only one is due and the complete performance of one of them extinguishes the obligation. The obligee or creditor cannot be compelled to receive part of one and part of the other undertaking of prestation. Article of 1999 Civil Code. So, sabi dito, ang alternative obligation daw ay an obligation is alternative when two things are equally due under an alternative. The obligor is bound to render only one of two or more items of performance. Where a person engages to do or to give several things, the payment of one will acquit him of all. So, pag alternative, kailangan ito ay only one prestation must be fulfilled to extinguish the obligation. So, example, the debtor shall have no right to choose to prestation which are impossible, unlawful, or which could not have been the object of the obligation. Next is facultative obligation. When the one prestation has been agreed upon, but the obligor may render another and the substitutions, the obligation is facultative. Article 1206 Civil Code. So, kapag sinabi nating facultative obligation, is refers to a type of obligation where one thing is due, but another is paid in its place. In such type of obligation, there is no alternative provided. The debtor is given the right of substitute the thing due with another that is not due. So next is joint and solidary obligation. A joint obligation may be defined as one obligation where there is concurrence of several creditors or several debtors, by virtue which is of creditors has right of to demand, while each of debtors is bound to render the compliance with her proportionate part of prestation which constitute of the object of obligation. So, sabi dito sa joint and solidary obligation, a joint obligation ay nakadefine sa obligation ay maaring tinutukoy bilang isang obligasyon kung saan mayroong pagsang-ayon ng maraming mga nagpapautang o maraming mga utang. By virtue, so ang kabutihan ay ang bawat isa sa mga nagpapautang ay may karapatang humiling habang ang bawat may utang ay nakasalalay na ibigay ang pagsunod sa binubuo ng isang object of obligations.